of Fundstrat Global Advisors. Tom, always good to have you back. You have definitely kept your head about you through Delta, and it's paid off. But as Rahel points out, geopolitics are a larger part of the conversation. Looks like we're finally there on taper. These supply crunches are not going away. Is any part of you looking for more chop rather than less?
Carl, that's a great question. All the things you've described are a wall of worry. And markets actually do better when investors are worried and hesitant because it is keeping cash on the sidelines, and therefore stocks can react to positive news. I think that's a situation we're in today. We wrote about it earlier this week, but if you look at money market funds raised by both retail institutions, retail investors were raising cash in August at a pace you haven't seen at all in 2021. And then if you look at things like sentiment, they got more bearish than any time in 2021. So I think we are definitely in a risk-on environment. It's healthy to see this wall of worry, but it's also important for things to be on the margin better. And that's what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I wonder where you are, too, on 2022 S&P earnings. BAML today does $215. They say we see downside risk to consensus EPS amid rising inflationary pressure. Dan Niles, friend of the show, says he's looking for multiple rate hikes in 22. Why is that not a liability if it plays out?
Those are definitely things to keep an eye on. Inflation can be both earnings friend and a headwind. And then, as Dan's talking about, there are other sort of external events that could take place. But when I look at 2022, I think people are overstating the risk from labor cost because where we're seeing inflation is really in the travel and leisure space, where that might be 25% of employment, but it's less than 7% of labor income. So there can be inflation there, but it's actually very mild in aggregate. And from an earnings perspective, I'm surprised BAML's number is so low. I mean, I think if you look at the operating leverage talked about by companies today, S&P earnings next year could be as high as 240. So I think it could be way above consensus. And of course, tech is going to be a big part of that.
Tom, you're bullish on crypto. You're bullish on the overall markets. What would change your mind? Would it be a big rally and a shift in sentiment so that more people got as positive as you are?
That's right, John. If short interest were to collapse and people were bullish, then we know that a lot of the firepower is used up on markets. But I would guess that we'd be at much higher levels if that was the case. And I think if COVID and sort of our comfort level in that deteriorates so that the economy faces downside risk, I think that's a headwind. But so far, it really looks like the soft surveys, like the sentiment, have dropped a lot more than the actual data, which means people have overreacted in the market side to COVID.
Thomas Deirdre, I always have to ask you about Bitcoin after touching 50,000. It's below 47K this morning. What's the next catalyst for the crypto ecosystem at large?
Well, there's a lot of, foremost, I'd say Bitcoin and digital assets have really performed admirably in the face of what looked like a pretty big crackdown from China and from US. So I think there's true underlying resilience. And then, of course, Bitcoin now, I think, is technically recovered to some key levels. I think that there's quite a lot of catalysts into year-end because, number one, it looks like products like NFTs, which really do improve the usefulness of crypto, have grown in adoption. I mean, some of the numbers are really impressive, and you're starting to see some crossover investing. And then, more importantly, I think that, when you look at outside the U.S., crypto is your risk-on asset. So I think that the fact that both China equities and crypto are rallying shows you that outside the U.S., there's actually a risk-on appetite as well.
Two more questions from me, Tom. I think one of your best calls of the year was really nailing that bottom on the 10-year yield around 120. We did have a few different desks this year now bring in their year-end forecast. B of A today goes from 190 to 155. I wonder where you are on the 10-year, if you think that chart's going to continue to go up to the upside. And then also on CHOP, in August, you said seasonality made it difficult to be a hero. And I wonder if that narrative changes as we work our way into the fall.
Yeah, both good questions. And on the yield, we've been watching it closely. It does seem to me that economic outlook is actually more resilient than consensus. I think people overreacted to the consumer sentiment surveys. And so we think there is upside to the yield. And I think the 1.5 might even be low. And then with regard to CHOP, I think that the move in the 10-year, along with the drop in the VIX, and then now with oil recovering pretty steadily, and now we're getting into September, which historically is actually a great month for equities when you have a strong first half. I think that the sort of chop is ending. I think September should be a really strong period for markets. So, I'd expect a rally, at least for the next 6 weeks, a pretty strong rally.
Oh, interesting. Finally, you've done, as we've said before, a lot of great high-frequency work on Delta and COVID in general. You've been highly attuned to the rollover that we're starting to see in the South. Do you worry about a surge in the North as kids go back to school?
Yes, Carl. I mean, I think one of the big risks is the transmissibility of Delta. I think in the Northeast, it does look like schools are really pushing towards either restricting activities for those who aren't vaccinated or trying to use some sort of mitigation measures. I think that should help. But, back to school is uncertain. But if we look at the Southeast, last year, there wasn't much mitigation taking place, and there wasn't really a back to school surge in the Southeast. So I'm somewhat hopeful that what we're seeing is a peak of Delta now across almost 18 states, maybe 20 now. It is really the last surge we'll see for the year.
Yeah. Well, the governor of Illinois just a few moments ago announced a statewide indoor mask mandate, regardless of vaccination status. So maybe the mitigation will be different in parts of the country closer to where we are. Tom, appreciate it always very much. Thanks. Tom
Yeah, great to see you.
A couple of other